One of the most accomplished English language films of the 1930s was quite certainly 1935's Mad Love, directed by Karl Freund and shot by Chester A. Lyons, as well as, capturing some additional shots, was the highly legendary Greg Toland, who Orson Welles claimed was the individual most responsible for Citizen Kane's iconic stature. Freund was an innovative cinematographer himself during the 1920s, shooting some of the most accomplished German films of that decade, including The Golem, The Last Laugh, Metropolis, and Berlin's Symphony of a City, as well as a couple of lesser-known works from the likes of Murnau Dreyer and the inferred Fritz Lang. And then moving to Hollywood, he shot Browning's 31 Dracula, one of the most influential works of cinematography in the medium's history, has a credit, well, later, on All Quiet on the Western Front, in retrospect. He's credited on IMDb, not in the film itself. Apparently he was not actually credited at the time. What's his name? Alpha Edison is the one who shot that film, I'm pretty sure. 32's Murder in the Rue Morgue, the 1940 Pride and Prejudice. I never saw it. I assume it was a popular film. The Zinnemann 1944 feature, The Seventh Cross, and John Huston's well-remembered, for a 40s film, at one time well-remembered, title Key Largo. Freund also did some directing, most famously the 1932 Mummy film, but also, obviously, this film, itself a remake/adaptation of the same novel of an accomplished 1924 silent directed by Caligari's Robert Wian, and is whichever, and is supposed to have directed Dracula to some extent, along with the credited Browning. An incredibly admirable exercise, Mad Love remains highly watchable, enjoyable, and among the most still enrapturing of 1930s horror features. There's very noble, modest, and refined art to composing the 1930s horror classics. There may be 90 minutes in length, max, featured quaint sets, static cameras, with a traditional employment of zooms, pans, and edits. Generally in black and white, one has to some degree, place themselves in a certain mindset to try and enjoy them at the same level that viewers would have even assessing them in the 1950s and 60s. Although their appeal at one time was there being the zenith of popular filmic art, the horror genre requires more employment of the medium itself than any other genre, even science fiction potentially. And by the time of the 1970s, the 30s horror titles seemed quaint, beautifully austere and graceful in their own way, like the old Greco-Roman sculptures now rendered marble white by the yield of time. But what is gripping about them now is how graspable all of their decisions are, or autorially are. Everything is visible in frame. It isn't a cacophony of edits. It isn't over-elaborate or bloated in any way. Not dependable on graphic visceral violence. They are arguably classier, even if that is a superficial designation. I won't say I prefer the horror films of the early sound era, pre-60s or 70s, that is, pre-Hammer, pre-exploitation, pre-Exorcist or Giallo, although they remain, I think, the most impressive filmic undertakings of their era, generally speaking. At barely over an hour, Mad Love is a stellar title, a noble entry amongst the wave of early-ish sound era horror features from the 30s and the 40s, which peaked quite plausibly with Turner's Leopard Man from 1943. Unless one is generally disinterested in horror cinema, I can't imagine that Mad Love will be at all disappointing. Now thinking back on it, maybe Bride of Frankenstein was the finest work in that continuum, released the same year as Mad Love. Also featuring Colin Clive, an extraordinary actor, best known for portraying Henry Frankenstein in the initial two Whale classics. Although if one had to list just 10, you'd best bet Mad Love deserves to be on that short list, without question.